The plantation appeared ordinary during daylight. Rows of cotton stretched evenly across the land. Work followed predictable rhythms. Bells rang when they always had. From the outside, nothing suggested disorder. Nothing hinted at disappearance. But plantations were not governed by daylight. They were governed by what happened after it. For years, no one spoke of the women who vanished after midnight. Not because no one noticed, but because noticing required naming and naming required risk. On plantations, silence was not absence. It was discipline. The first disappearance was treated as an exception. A woman assigned to kitchen work did not report to the fields the next morning. The overseer assumed illness. The mistress assumed laziness. By evening, her name was quietly removed from the work rotation. No search followed. People waited for her to return. She never did. Weeks later, another woman vanished. Then another. Not from the same cabin. Not from the same duties. No consistent age, no shared background. The only pattern was timing. They were last seen at night. Always after the bell. Always quietly. The enslaved people noticed immediately. They noticed because disappearance is loud when it happens among those who count every presence. They counted each other because no one else did. At first, they told themselves the women had been sold. That was the explanation that hurt least. Sale meant distance, not erasure. Sale meant the possibility of survival elsewhere. But no wagons came. No traders signed papers. No goodbyes were forced in daylight. The women simply stopped existing inside the plantation's memory. That was when fear shifted. Fear on plantations was common, but this was different. This was not fear of punishment. It was fear of the unknown structure beneath daily order. The overseer dismissed questions quickly. "Women move," he said. "That's how this works." But his tone carried irritation, not certainty. The mistress avoided the topic entirely. She did not like disorder she could not supervise. The master was absent more often. Night grew heavier. Women began sleeping in groups. Cabins that once closed their doors at dusk stayed slightly open. Not for comfort, but for awareness. To hear footsteps. To hear breathing. Midnight became a boundary. Before it there was exhaustion. After it there was vigilance. One woman, named Clara, began to count. She did not write anything down. Writing was dangerous. Instead she counted in memory. Names. Faces. Absences. Clara worked the laundry, close enough to hear things others did not. Conversations from the house. Voices from the yard late at night. Sounds that did not belong to routine. She noticed that the women who disappeared were not random. They shared one thing. They were women who had been reassigned closer to the house shortly before vanishing. Kitchen. Sewing room. Night cleaning. Duties that required trust. Trust was rarely given without expectation. Clara did not speak of this openly. She spoke of it carefully. In fragments. In questions that sounded like observations. Funny how quiet that cabin is now. Seems like the house needs new help often. Others understood. No one answered directly. Because understanding was dangerous enough. The plantation did not acknowledge the disappearances. That too was deliberate. Acknowledgement would require explanation. Explanation would create records. Records created accountability. Instead, the system behaved as if nothing unusual was happening. Work continued. Punishments were enforced. Meals were served. But the women began to change. They watched the night sky differently. They noticed who walked where after dark. They memorized steps and pauses. Clara realized something unsettling. The disappearances were not chaotic. They were organized. Women were taken on nights when supervision elsewhere was minimal. When storms covered sound. When the master was present. When certain guards were assigned. This was not opportunistic violence. It was structured. And structure meant intention. One night, Clara heard a scream. Not loud. Short. Cut off quickly. She froze, cloth in her hands, breath held tight. No alarm followed. No lights came on. The scream did not repeat. The next morning, one more woman was missing. The plantation responded with routine. Her work was redistributed. Her name was not spoken again. That was when Clara understood something fundamental. The plantation was not hiding the disappearances. It was depending on people not asking. Fear was doing the work of silence. But fear has limits, especially when survival is already fragile. The women began leaving small signals for one another. Not messages, signs. A tied cloth outside a cabin meant stay awake. An overturned bucket meant someone was taken nearby. A lamp left burning too late meant do not come near. The system of warning grew quietly. The plantation did not notice. Or perhaps it did and calculated that fear still outweighed resistance. Clara did not plan escape. Escape was too loud. She planned awareness. She began avoiding reassignment. She slowed her work deliberately. She made herself unremarkable. Unremarkable people are harder to justify removing. Still, the net tightened. One evening, Clara was told she would begin night duties in the house. The words were delivered casually. Her stomach dropped. She did not protest. Protest marked people. She nodded and accepted. That night she did not sleep. She watched the moon pass slowly overhead. She listened to the plantation breathe. She wondered how many women had stood where she stood, thinking the same thoughts, hoping the same hopes. She wondered whether disappearance was the point. Whether the fear created by uncertainty was more effective than punishment ever had been. Just before midnight, footsteps approached her cabin. Measured. Unhurried. Not sneaking. That terrified her more than stealth ever could. The knock came softly. Controlled. Not asking permission. Clara did not move. The knock came again. In that moment she understood something clearly. The plantation was not losing women. It was removing them. And removal did not require chaos. It required compliance. The door handle turned slowly. And as it did, Clara realized the truth that had been forming for weeks. What happened after midnight was not accidental. It was policy. No one ever said the words out loud. Not abduction. Not removal. Not purpose. But after Clara was reassigned to night duties, the plantation's silence began to feel shaped, designed around something it did not want daylight to touch. Clara did not open the door that night. She stood still, breath shallow, as the handle turned and stopped. After a long moment, the footsteps withdrew. Not hurried. Not confused. Certain. The next morning no one mentioned it. But Clara noticed something else. Another woman, newer, quieter, recently reassigned, was gone. The pattern adjusted. When one target resisted, the system simply moved to the next. That was when Clara understood the truth the plantation was built to conceal. Disappearance was not punishment. It was function. The women were not being taken because they had done something wrong. They were being selected because they were useful in ways that could not be acknowledged. The house at night was not empty. That alone unsettled Clara. During the day the house performed order. Clean lines. Clear roles. Predictable authority. But at night, movement continued, quiet, controlled, intentional. Lanterns were lit in rooms that had no daytime purpose. Doors were unlocked that never opened before sunrise. Guards were reassigned not outward but inward. Protection was not aimed at stopping entry. It was aimed at preventing exit. Clara began listening more closely during her laundry work. Sheets told stories if you knew how to read them. Dirt where none should be. Water used at unusual hours. Items missing then returned. The plantation was managing something it could not afford to explain. An explanation, Clara realized, was far more dangerous to them than disappearance. The women who vanished were never spoken of again. Not as losses. Not as transfers. Not even as mistakes. Their absence was treated as correction. This created a particular kind of fear. Not the fear of pain. The fear of erasure. Women stopped asking where others had gone. They stopped using names. They avoided proximity to the house. Reassignment was no longer seen as advancement, but as exposure. The plantation responded by forcing proximity. Night duties expanded. Rotations shortened. Refusal became suspicious. One woman tried to fake illness. She was sold within the week. Another attempted to injure herself badly enough to be deemed unfit. She disappeared that same night. Clara realized then that resistance did not need to be loud to be punished. It only needed to be recognized. She began documenting in the only way available to her, through people. She whispered observations to women she trusted. She taught them to notice timing instead of faces, to watch assignments instead of actions. Who moves at night? She asked softly. Who decides? Who never gets taken? The answers formed a quiet map. The master was always present on disappearance nights. The overseer never was. The mistress never asked questions, but she approved schedules. The house servants who lasted the longest were those who complied without curiosity, and the women who vanished were those whose presence created complication. Some were young, some were older, some had recently given birth. Some had refused, gently, to comply with expectations never written down. The purpose was not singular. It was layered. Control. Secrecy. Maintenance of power that could not exist under observation. Clara understood then that the plantation's greatest fear was not exposure from outside. It was coherence from within. If the women connected their experiences into one understanding, the system would be named. And naming is the first step toward collapse. So the plantation used the night. Night erased witnesses. Night fragmented memory. Night allowed actions without narrative. But the night had a flaw. It relied on people believing they were alone. They were not. Women began sleeping in shifts. One awake while others rested. Sounds were noted. Movements tracked. Not written, remembered. A soft whistle meant danger nearby. A candle relit meant someone had not returned. An untouched bowl meant absence. Clara never positioned herself as leader. Leadership attracted attention. She positioned herself as listener. That was safer. One evening, a woman approached her quietly. "They took my sister," she whispered. "She worked sewing." Clara nodded. She was told it was temporary. Clara nodded again. "She hasn't come back." "I know," Clara said softly. "What do they do with them?" Clara paused. "I don't know everything," she said truthfully. "But I know it isn't random." That was enough. Fear shared carefully became resolve. The plantation noticed the change, though it could not identify its source. Women avoided night reassignment more openly now. Productivity slowed in subtle ways. Compliance remained, but trust did not. The mistress grew more severe. Rules multiplied. Schedules tightened. The overseer was ordered to restore discipline. But discipline requires belief. And belief had begun to fracture. Clara was summoned again for night duty. This time refusal would be noted. She agreed. Not because she intended to comply, but because understanding required proximity. The night she entered the house, she noticed the difference immediately. The rooms used were not random. They were chosen for isolation. The doors locked from the outside. The windows sealed. This was not chaos. It was infrastructure. She was not taken that night. She was tested, washed, measured. She complied without resistance. She spoke only when spoken to. She asked no questions. Compliance, she understood, bought time. Time allowed observation. And observation was the one thing the plantation could not fully prevent. As dawn approached, Clara was released. Alive. Unremoved. But changed. She returned to the quarters carrying confirmation. The disappearances were intentional. The night was designed. And the women were not expected to survive long enough to connect at all. That assumption was the plantation's mistake. Because connection had already begun. And once people understand why something happens, even without knowing how, fear loses its shape. It becomes anger. Or clarity. Or preparation. Clara did not know which would come next. But she knew this. The door that opened at midnight was not meant to be questioned. And the fact that it was, that people now watched it, counted it, anticipated it, meant the plantation's secret was no longer sealed. It was leaking. Quietly. Relentlessly. Understanding did not arrive all at once. It arrived in fragments, moments layered over days, days over weeks, until the women no longer needed proof to know what was happening. They did not know every detail. They did not need to. They understood enough. And understanding changed the meaning of silence. Before, silence had been reflex. A habit shaped by survival. You stayed quiet because quiet kept you alive. You avoided names, avoided patterns, avoided thinking too far ahead. Now, silence became something else. A decision. Clara noticed it first in how women spoke to one another, not with words but with timing. Conversations ended sooner. Questions were redirected instead of ignored. Women stopped pretending not to notice when someone was reassigned to night duty. They noticed. They remembered. They adjusted. The plantation mistook this for obedience. The work still got done. No open resistance appeared. No arguments broke out. On the surface, order remained. But underneath, something had shifted. Silence was no longer empty. It was intentional. Women began choosing what silence was for. They stayed silent about fear but not about warning. They stayed silent about suspicion, but not about preparation. They stopped asking why aloud, but they started planning when. When to stay awake, when to sleep in groups, when to move closer to one another instead of farther apart. Clara became careful with her role. She did not speak to everyone. She spoke to the ones who listened without asking for certainty. Certainty was dangerous. Awareness was enough. She taught them how to notice changes in routine, how to recognize nights when the house felt different, how to sense when guards were placed inward rather than outward. "Those are the nights," she said quietly. "Not all nights, just some." That distinction mattered. Panic makes mistakes. Preparation does not. The women learned to pass information without appearing to pass it. A shared look, a pause before entering a cabin, a decision to stay awake longer than usual. The plantation responded with pressure. Night duties increased again. The rotation shortened. Women were reassigned with less warning. Force followed awareness. But force no longer surprised them. The mistress grew impatient. She noticed that women returned from night duty quieter than before. Not shaken. Not emotional. Observant. That unsettled her. She began questioning servants individually, softly at first, then more sharply. "Have you noticed changes?" she asked one woman. "No, ma'am," the woman replied calmly. That answer was technically true. Change had already happened. The plantation was simply late to recognize it. One night, a woman named Ruth did not return. She had been reassigned 2 days earlier. This time, the women did not wait to see if she would come back. They marked her absence immediately. They counted. They noted the timing. They remembered who had spoken to her last. And something different happened. No one cried openly. Grief, they had learned, was loud. Instead, they gathered closer. Ruth's disappearance was not treated as mystery. It was treated as confirmation. That clarity removed something the plantation depended on: confusion. Confusion keeps people isolated. Understanding connects them. The next night, when footsteps moved between cabins after midnight, someone whistled softly. A warning. 2 women shifted places. One stayed awake. Another pretended to sleep. Doors remained unlatched, not for entry but for escape if needed. Nothing happened that night. But the message had been sent. The plantation noticed resistance in subtle ways. Night duties became harder to assign. Women suddenly developed small injuries. Fatigue spread unevenly. Compliance slowed without breaking. The overseer was ordered to intervene. He increased surveillance. Men were placed near the quarters after dark. Lanterns stayed lit longer. But light reveals as much as it hides. Women learned patrol patterns faster than the overseer expected. Because watching had become practice. Clara understood something important then. The plantation had always assumed that fear would prevent coordination. It had underestimated endurance. Endurance had given these women time to learn, time to connect, time to decide. The decision was not rebellion. Not yet. It was boundary. They chose what silence would protect. They stayed silent about names. They stayed silent about plans. But they no longer stayed silent about danger. When someone was reassigned, others noticed immediately. When the house prepared for night activity, the quarters responded. Not with confrontation. With adjustment. The plantation began to feel resistance without seeing it. That was its greatest discomfort. Power depends on visibility. This resistance was invisible. One evening, Clara was summoned again. Not for night duty. For questioning. The mistress sat across from her, hands folded neatly. "You've been here a long time," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Clara replied. "You're respected." Clara did not answer. "People listen to you." That was not a question. Clara met her gaze briefly. "I mind my work." The mistress studied her. "Good," she said. "You should continue to do so." It was a warning. Clara accepted it calmly. She had expected it. That night she spoke less than ever. Silence, she knew now, was not weakness. It was leverage. The women were no longer asking how to stop the disappearances. They were asking how to reduce them. How to make selection harder. How to make removal riskier. How to ensure that if someone vanished, others would know immediately. That knowledge alone changed the balance. Because disappearance depends on isolation. And isolation had begun to fail. The plantation could still take women. But it could no longer do so quietly. Each removal left ripples. Each absence tightened attention. And attention was dangerous. Clara did not know how this would end. She did not imagine victory. She imagined survival, extended, shared, intentional. And that, she realized, was already a form of defiance. The plantation had designed the night to erase women without trace. What it had created instead was a network of memory that refused to forget. Silence had not been broken. It had been repurposed. And once silence stops serving power, power begins to unravel. The plantation did not react immediately. That delay was not mercy. It was calculation. Those in control had learned long ago that sudden force created visible fractures. And visibility was dangerous. What unsettled them now was not resistance, but resistance they could not point to. Nothing obvious had changed. No shouting. No refusals. No broken rules they could punish publicly. And yet, the nights no longer belonged entirely to them. Assignments became harder to enforce. Women fell ill in patterns that made no sense. Tasks slowed without explanation. Night duties were fulfilled, but not with the same isolation as before. The plantation had lost something subtle but essential: predictability. So it responded the only way it knew how, by tightening its grip and stepping closer to what it feared. Lanterns were ordered to remain lit until dawn. Guards were instructed to move inward, closer to the quarters, rather than outward toward the fields. Doors once left to servants were now watched. The mistress herself began appearing after sunset. That was new. Her presence unsettled the routine more than she realized. She walked the edges of the quarters in silence, observing faces, listening for sounds that were no longer careless. She noticed women gathering in twos and threes instead of sleeping alone. She noticed how quickly eyes lifted when footsteps passed. She noticed how quiet had become deliberate. Silence had weight now. And weight presses back. The overseer suggested harsher measures. Random checks, he said. Unannounced. The mistress hesitated. Randomness invited attention. But fear was beginning to outweigh discretion. The first search happened just after midnight. Lantern lights spilled into cabins without warning. Women were ordered awake, questioned, examined for signs of defiance. Nothing was found. That was the problem. The plantation expected fear to scatter coordination. Instead it found calm. Eyes lowered when required. Answers delivered carefully. Bodies still. Nothing incriminating. Nothing submissive either. The second search came 2 nights later. Again nothing. By the third search, frustration had replaced strategy. And frustration makes mistakes. A woman named Eliza was taken that night, not reassigned, not questioned, simply removed. The order came suddenly, executed quickly. The plantation assumed shock would restore silence. It misjudged what silence had become. By morning, Eliza's absence was known across the quarters. Not through wailing or protest. Through acknowledgement. Work slowed everywhere she had once been assigned. Meals were prepared unevenly. Tasks were forgotten and then remembered late. Disruption spread without explanation. The mistress demanded answers. None came. That afternoon, Clara was summoned again. This time the room was not quiet. The mistress did not sit. "You are being difficult," she said plainly. Clara stood still. "I don't tolerate disorder," the mistress continued. "And something is happening." Clara said nothing. "That silence you think protects you?" the mistress snapped. "It doesn't." Clara met her gaze slowly. "Silence has always been here," she said carefully. "It's just being noticed now." The room froze. For the first time, the plantation heard its fears spoken aloud. The mistress dismissed her immediately. That night something changed. The searches stopped. Instead, the plantation chose exposure. Women were reassigned openly. Guards escorted them in visible pairs. The mistress made no attempt to hide her involvement. Control stepped into the light. And in doing so, revealed its dependence on secrecy. The disappearances slowed, but not because the plantation had grown kinder. Because attention had become too costly. Each reassignment now carried weight. Each absence created questions the plantation could no longer pretend were private. Outsiders noticed movement at odd hours. Visitors remarked on increased security. Whispers traveled beyond the property lines. The plantation had succeeded in one thing. It had made itself visible. That visibility stripped it of the quiet efficiency it once relied on. Clara understood then that resistance had forced a shift, not toward justice but toward exposure. And exposure weakened systems built on silence. The women adjusted again. They became more careful, less obvious, more patient. They did not celebrate the reduction in disappearances. They prepared for retaliation. Because power rarely retreats without attempting to reassert itself. But something irreversible had happened. The plantation had revealed fear. Fear of coordination. Fear of memory. Fear of women who understood what was being done to them. That fear lingered. It altered decisions. Delayed actions. Introduced doubt where confidence once lived. And doubt is corrosive. The plantation could still punish. But it could no longer pretend that punishment was unseen. That pretense had been its shield. Now it was gone. Clara returned to her cabin before dawn. She did not speak to anyone. She did not need to. The women already understood. Control had stepped into the light. And in doing so, it had shown where it was most fragile. Exposure changed the plantation in ways force could not repair. It did not collapse. It did not descend into chaos. On the surface, it continued to function. Fields tended, meals prepared, routines followed. But something essential had fractured. Before, authority moved invisibly. Orders passed quietly. Punishments occurred in isolation. Disappearances slipped into memory as rumors, softened by uncertainty. Now nothing moved without witnesses. Force had stepped forward to reassert control, and in doing so, it had lost the advantage of silence. The overseer doubled his efforts. Rules were reiterated. Expectations sharpened. Small infractions were punished swiftly and publicly. The goal was fear. The result was something else. People began watching the punishers instead of one another. Eyes followed the overseer's path. Conversations paused when he approached, not in panic but in calculation. Women noted which guards hesitated, which avoided eye contact, which enforced orders too eagerly. Power was no longer abstract. It had faces, and faces can be remembered. The mistress grew restless. She sensed that discipline was no longer restoring control, it was revealing weakness. Each punishment required explanation. Each explanation invited comparison to previous ones. Consistency mattered now. And consistency was hard to maintain when fear had made decisions reactive instead of deliberate. The disappearances did not resume as before. They could not. Each reassignment required justification. Each removal triggered attention that spread faster than the plantation could manage. Rumors reached nearby farms. Questions were asked by visitors who noticed increased patrols and tense routines. The plantation responded by closing inward. Fewer visitors. Fewer outside eyes. Isolation returned, but not in the way it once had. Now, isolation worked against them. Inside the quarters, memory had settled. The women remembered who had vanished. They remembered when the searches began. They remembered the night Eliza was taken openly as an act of warning. That memory did not fade. Force had confirmed what silence once hid. And confirmation cannot be unlearned. Clara noticed subtle changes everywhere. Women worked closer together. Tasks overlapped intentionally. Nighttime movement slowed, not from fear but from caution. The plantation tried to create division. Certain women were given small privileges. Others were reassigned suddenly, separated from those they trusted. But separation failed to erase connection. Information had already been shared. Patterns had already been understood. Division arrived too late. One night, a guard hesitated during a routine patrol. He paused outside a cabin longer than necessary, then moved on without explanation. No one spoke of it, but it was noted. Another night, a reassignment order was quietly delayed. A woman remained in the quarters despite being listed elsewhere. No punishment followed. That absence of response was louder than any command. The plantation was hesitating. Hesitation spreads. The overseer grew harsher. The mistress grew quieter. Neither could restore what had been lost. Authority depends on certainty, the belief that power knows what it is doing. That belief had cracked. Force attempted to fill the gap. But force requires energy. It requires constant reinforcement. It exposes the effort behind control. And effort reveals strain. Women began to sense when enforcement was weakest. During transitions, during uncertainty, during moments when orders contradicted one another. They adjusted accordingly. Not in rebellion. In survival. The plantation unraveled not through defiance but through inefficiency. Tasks took longer. Decisions stalled. Orders were revised, then revised again. Confidence eroded. Clara understood then that what had changed was not behavior, but belief. The plantation no longer believed it could act without consequence. And those beneath it no longer believed silence was the price of survival. Force could punish bodies. It could not erase understanding. And understanding, once shared, does not disappear when people do. The plantation would endure for years yet, but it would never again be as quiet, never again as certain, never again as unseen. Something had survived the disappearances. Not evidence, not proof, memory. And memory, unlike silence, cannot be controlled once it belongs to many. The plantation did not end with a single moment of reckoning. There was no uprising, no confession, no official acknowledgement of what had been done. That was not its greatest failure. Its greatest failure was that something endured beyond its control and beyond its timeline. Years passed. Faces aged. Names changed. Some women were sold. Others died quietly where they had labored. The overseer was replaced. The mistress withdrew from daily operations, her authority thinning into formality. Outwardly, the plantation adjusted. Security relaxed. Searches ceased entirely. Disappearances became rare, then almost non-existent. To an outsider, it might have appeared that order had been restored. But order is not the same as power. Power depends on belief. And belief had shifted. The women no longer believed the plantation was omniscient. They no longer believed silence guaranteed safety. They no longer believed that what happened at night could remain unspoken forever. That belief had been the foundation of control. Without it, authority became performative, still capable of punishment but no longer unquestioned. Clara lived long enough to see that change settle into permanence. She did not speak of the past openly. She did not recount details. She did not offer explanations to those who came later. She did something quieter. She corrected omissions. When a new woman arrived and was warned only vaguely about certain duties, Clara would add a sentence. Not an accusation. A clarification. When they move people at night, she would say calmly, it's never without reason. She did not explain further. She didn't have to. That sentence carried memory. Others did the same. In kitchens. In fields. In whispered conversations that did not feel like whispers. The story became fragmented. But fragments are harder to erase than a single narrative. Fragments adapt. They survive transport. They endure separation. They resurface unexpectedly. Children grew up hearing incomplete versions. Women who never experienced the disappearances still knew not to walk alone after dark. Men noticed changes they could not name. Women refusing certain tasks, insisting on others, coordinating without instruction. The plantation adjusted to accommodate those behaviors. Not out of compassion. Out of necessity. Control had learned its limits. Years later, when records were examined, ledgers, reassignment notes, dates scratched and rewritten, nothing explicit appeared. No crime. No admission. But gaps remained. Patterns that made no sense without context. Historians would later call it anomalies in labor allocation. They would speculate about illness, about logistics. They would never write what the women already knew, because the truth did not survive in ink. It survived in practice, in the way people moved, in the way tasks were shared, in the way silence was no longer offered freely. The plantation's greatest failure was not that it was exposed. Exposure fades. Its greatest failure was that memory did not. Memory did not need proof. It did not require permission. It lived in behavior, passed quietly, embedded into daily life so deeply it appeared natural. By the time the plantation finally declined, through economics, through age, through forces larger than itself, it was already hollow. Its authority had outlived its effectiveness. What remained was land without certainty, structures without obedience, and a history that refused to stay buried. The women who disappeared were never recovered. Their names did not appear in official accounts, but they were not erased. They survived in the adjustments made afterward, in the caution that replaced trust, in the understanding that silence can be broken, and once broken, it never returns in the same form. That was the plantation's true undoing. Not rebellion, not exposure, but survival. Because what survives teaches. and what teaches cannot be controlled.